We're going to take a short amount of your day today. I know everyone's pretty busy getting everyone deployed and out in the workforce and making sure, again, we're set up properly. And certainly that's what this presentation is about, is really to educate everyone on kind of what we're seeing out there in the workplace and kind of things that you need to be concerned about. So my name is John Mess. I am our Senior Security Advisor over at Network Center. Been in the technology space a long time. So we are going to be running through our presentation today. We'll tell you a little bit about Network Center if you're not familiar with us. We are about 34 years old, founded in 1986. We went to 100% employee owned 5 years ago. We're roughly 85 employees and growing quite rapidly. Headquartered in Fargo, employees in 5 states, and really again focusing on the technology solutions and security around that. I think everything we do with technology now is really security first. So again, we're going to try to focus a little bit on that today and this remote workforce that we're now having to deal with amongst this crisis.
Awesome. Thank you, John. I'm going to start off with a little bit about what we've seen across our customer base and not even our customers, just maybe other companies out there. Number one, people are scrambling right now, even still today, especially with the Minnesota order to stay at home this last week. More and more people are just trying to get their workers up and running as quick as possible. You know, most of them, especially if you're in a non-regulated industry, do not have any formal policies or procedures in place. So they're kind of making things up as they go. And my third point there is ultimately just doing whatever it takes to get the job done. And, you know, the biggest thing I want to convey is that we don't fault anyone for that. I mean, this is a very unique time. Very unique circumstances. A lot of people are just trying to stay in business, and we get that, and we can appreciate that. So, you know, today's conversation is more wrapped around how can we help you get from on-prem to remote workers, and talk about some of the things that we're seeing, some good things, maybe some less good things, and then just talk a little bit about, as the dust settles, some of the things that we really need to come back and focus on just to make sure that we are secure. So talking a little bit about the technology that we've seen out there. So a variety of things. We've seen, you know, people just deploying laptops to all of their workers. It doesn't really matter if they've been office workers, if they've been a receptionist, if they've been, financial, if they've been, any position within an organization, we see companies dishing out laptops. And for those who can't get laptops, because quite frankly, the supply chain is quite constrained right now. So even if you wanted to get a laptop, you're looking out a couple weeks minimum, unless you happen to find some at the local big box retailers. Desktops, we have seen customers sending their employees local desktops and monitors home with them. It's literally pick it up, put it in the car, drive it home, and then set it up just like you were in the office. It's very much less portable than a laptop, but quite frankly, it gets the job done. And then the third piece is we are seeing people giving their employees the ability to use their home workstations to accomplish tasks for their employer. From a remote access perspective, this is how are we getting connected to our data? How are we getting connected to our applications? We're seeing several different things out there. Many of these are technologies that have been in place for a long time. They're nothing new, but I understand that not everybody has been exposed to them. So that's why we're discussing them now. Number one is virtual desktops for organizations that have more than just a couple employees. We are seeing people spin up virtual machines in AWS and Azure, just trying to create a unified desktop, a unified computing experience where they can have control over those machines. We see terminal servers and Citrix servers deployed for those. Those are customers that have typically already had those in place, and they are just leveraging those technologies to a greater extent than they may have been, leveraging VPNs, tons of VPNs calls coming in to get those set up. An organization that may have only allowed a couple of executives previously to connect to their networks remotely are changing their tactics a little bit and allowing any remote worker to connect up remotely via VPN. And what we're seeing as well is a lot of the manufacturers are actually offering the ability to increase VPN license counts at no cost, mainly because they want to help as well. We are seeing people connect directly, and what I mean by that is just basically open up a firewall and allowing direct access to a server or to a workstation inside their environment. And we'll talk a little bit about the risks wrapped around that. Additionally, computer sharing software, so if I've got a home machine and I just want to reach my desktop at the office, we are seeing customers also deploy like LogMeIn or Connect, or I know there's about 1 million different brands of remote software. So those are some of the remote access capabilities as well. And then as far as communication channels, right, those really haven't changed much except for probably video conferencing and file sharing. So email is still email, right? We're still seeing customers actually probably leverage their email even more than they were before. And also utilizing that as a means to transfer files. And we'll also discuss the risks wrapped around that in a little bit. Video conferencing. So, you can see myself, for example, today I actually have video on, and we are leveraging the WebEx platform, but that's not the only platform. We're seeing Microsoft Teams being utilized. We're seeing Zoom being utilized. We're seeing I think there's Join.me. There's a million different ways that you can do video conferencing, and I think it's really important right now to consider, if you're not doing it today, consider doing it, because that connection through video really makes a difference with employees. And then the final one is file sharing. We're seeing OneDrive adoption, share file adoption. We're seeing Dropbox, Box, really any kind of public file sharing ability that's out there is being implemented at this time. So many of these technologies would have been a no-no to a lot of organizations 2 weeks ago. But given the rapid development of how our current situation is going, people are just kind of throwing up their hands and saying, we've got to function. And again, we get that, we understand that, and today we just want to help educate you on some of the risks wrapped around that, so that you can make the best decision for your organization. So we talk about technical concerns wrapped around some of these things, right? So one of the first things we talked about was, devices, laptops, desktops, or employee-owned equipment. And, when we talk about information security in general, it is primarily about managing risk. That means identifying the level of risk that your organization is willing to take without going out of business, or without, causing a huge data issue. So when we get back to the devices side of things, the company owned versus employee owned, when we would absolutely, number one, recommend laptops for your workforce. But as I mentioned, the supply chain is kind of constrained. So if you're not able to get laptops today, the secondary recommendation for you is to absolutely pick up those desktops and send them home. Third, and least desirable, is allowing your employees to use their employee-owned devices. And the main reason behind that is that you have zero control over those devices unless you're forcing some kind of MDM, device management software on those to enforce standards like antivirus, levels, workstation levels, Windows patching levels, or Mac if it's a Mac. Just the security aspects around it. And you might say, well, yeah, but they're connecting up to my Citrix server, or they're connecting to a virtual desktop somewhere, so it's not really on that local machine. Well, the truth is that they're still accessing those things through that local machine. So that thing could have, when I say thing, I mean their device could already have a keylogger on it, for example. So if it was exploited previously or compromised, those keystrokes that they're typing into that local machine could be compromised and then used from an attacker perspective down the road. So again, it's all about managing risk there. And while we would advise against it, we understand the situation. And if that is your only option, certainly there are things that we as technologists can help put in place to mitigate that risk or at least lessen it a little bit. So now we look at remote access, right? How should we be connecting? Previously, I mentioned that there are many different ways that remote workers are connecting today, uh, especially now more than they did before. And we see it via both secure and insecure mechanisms. What I mean by that is some people are leveraging Citrix or they're leveraging a VPN and getting connected that way. But we're also seeing people open up RDP, which is port 3389, to the world and then connecting in that way. And that is a very insecure way to do it. And if I could advise anything, number one would be shut that down right away. And let's talk about solutions, because we have seen way too many organizations compromised leveraging 3389 being open to the world. The fourth point here is device management, right? So whether we are deploying laptops or desktops, if they are company-owned devices, we want to make sure that we have controls in place that will allow us to monitor things like patch levels for both Windows and third-party applications. We want to be able to remotely manage antivirus to make sure that our employees on the latest patch levels, things like that. If we need to deploy a new piece of software, leveraging some specific uh, tool to allow us to deploy that without having to bring everyone back into the office, right? So it's as much about security as it is about efficiency. And if you don't have control of those devices as they go out into the field, then you lose some of that potential security wrapped around them. So let's talk a little bit specifically about how we can go about doing some of this. I mean, number one is understand what it is that you're actually protecting. And as I mentioned earlier, is it regulated? Is it proprietary? How sensitive is the data? You really should think about classifying it. So if there's data that anybody has the ability to access, and we don't really care if it gets public, well, that should be treated very differently than data that has like credit card numbers or social security numbers and things of that nature. The second thing on here is enhancing your authentication strength. And what that boils down to is enforcing stronger password policies. And I'm not just saying that you're going to say, all right, everybody, you've got to have a strong password. I'm talking more about putting the technical controls in place that enforce it. And if you're in an Active Directory environment, with Windows Server, you have the ability to do that through group policy. If you happen to have Office 365, there are also policies within there that you can enforce those so that if you say they need to have strong passwords, the system will force them to have strong passwords. The second thing on there is enable MFA. And MFA is multi-factor authentication. And really, we have seen the majority of email breaches in the last year could have been mitigated by implementing this one thing. And basically what it means is that if a user's credentials were compromised, they cannot get into a system that is protected with MFA without that secondary level of authentication. And it can be a lot of different things. A lot of them have apps on phones where you just get a code, you type that code in, it might text you a code. There's even voice calls that will call you and authorize you as that secondary authentication, or it'll email you and say, hey, reply to this for approval. There are a lot of different methods for deploying MFA, multi-factor authentication, and there are also a lot of different tools and brands that offer that. So If we can take anything away from today, that would definitely be a big part of it. Third point is policies. And this is something that a lot of organizations who don't fall into that regulated side of the world typically don't think about. If you're in a regulated industry, banking, financial, or healthcare, and various others, you're essentially mandated to do this. But it's one of those things that right now, policies, even if you're mandated to do it, may be taking a back seat, right? And it's important, especially as the dust settles a little bit, to come back to that for both regulated and non-regulated, especially, and think about defining some policies. And no security conversation would be complete without a little bit of discussion around current threats. So new targets, we have seen this last week, the World Health Organization being directly targeted by attackers, and their goal, it's believed from what I've been reading, is that state actors, their goal is to identify, current vaccine progress for the COVID pandemic. They want to know, the types of data. What is the World Health Organization seeing as far as, how many infections, et cetera, where in the world. Apparently, that will help a country somehow if they want to target it. It doesn't make sense to me, but different things drive different people. Hospitals and healthcare. Surprisingly, there was a couple of hacker groups this last week that came out and said, you know what, during this pandemic, we're going to leave hospitals alone. We're going to leave healthcare alone. Well, unfortunately, the rest of the cyber criminal world didn't take note, and there are hospitals that are being targeted more so now than they were before. So, from a healthcare perspective, that's an industry that was getting hit hard before, and they're getting hit even harder now. Work from home employees, I mean, that's just a ripe target. As I mentioned earlier, most people aren't used to working from home. Therefore, maybe they're not, leveraging some of the best practices out there. Maybe they're hitting up risky websites and we don't have web filtering in place. That is a prime target for these threat actors to be able to compromise a workstation and then start stealing data or credentials and stuff like that.
Very good. Well, that is all from us. We appreciate everyone's time. And we'll talk soon. Thanks.